The Twin Knights by Osamu Tezuka. So I've talked about Osamu Tezuka, or Tezuka Osamu as he's known in Japan, a few times before on this channel. And in the description down below I'll link to the previous books of his that I've reviewed. But just to recap briefly, Tezuka Osamu is known as the Walt Disney of Japan for a few reasons. One, he was roughly contemporary with Disney. His peak period was during the 50s and 60s. Secondly, he was incredibly prolific, just like Walt Disney was. And then thirdly, he was greatly influenced by Walt Disney's animation style. So he got to start a little bit after Disney was already a household name, and you can see, just kind of flipping through this, maybe these very Disney-esque looking characters. So he was huge in Japan in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and still is very fondly remembered to this day. And when I lived in Japan, I picked up a lot of his comics from the bookstores where they were readily available. There were, at least when I lived in Japan, which was the early 2000s, 2001 through 2009, the comic books were usually sold in two formats. One was a book which actually looked a lot like this. Same kind of, it was in Japanese instead of English, but same framing on the cover, about the same size. And then the other was a weekly magazine, which would reprint Tezuka Osamu's classic comics. And that one was quite a bit bigger. So that was, the comics in Japan are more of like a square shape than a rectangle, but it was about like this big. And I mention that because this is going to be a standard complaint of mine when I review this. I mentioned the same thing when I was reviewing Astro Boy. I really feel like a lot of this animation should be on a bigger page. It's all right for some of these panels, but some of the more detailed panels, I just feel like there's a lot of nice detail here that I would just like a larger page to absorb it in. I don't know how much of this is, here's a good example here, huh? I mean, there's a lot happening in this panel. It would be better to see it on a bigger page. But, I don't know how much of this is middle-aged talking. I'm right on the cusp of having to get reading glasses, something my eye doctor has talked to me about, which apparently is perfectly normal once you hit middle age. But, I would have liked to see this on a bit of a bigger page, as it's sometimes reprinted in Japan. But even in Japan, this would be the most common way you would find this collection nowadays. The Tezuka Osamu magazine only came out once a month and only had a few stories in it. So if you wanted to find his vast back catalog of stories, you go into a bookstore where they're bound like this. But I mean, it is just worth comparing. Even comparing to like a standard American comic, you can see that this is a condensed space here. Anyways, that complaint out of the way. This is one of Tezuka Osamu's comics he made for girls. So he was incredibly prolific, and he wrote across all different genres. And at one point, his publisher wanted him to write stuff for girls. Japanese comics, unlike American comics, caters to a wide variety of audiences. So in American comics, as has been pointed out by many different people before me, but I'll just restate this briefly. American comics, somewhere along the line, got pigeonholed into superhero stories which only appeal to adolescent boys, primarily appeal to adolescent boys. But it didn't have to be that way. And in Japan and other countries, Comics appeal to a wide variety of audiences and also appeal to young girls. And this is one of the comics that Tezuka Osamu made for young girls. So he actually published in the mid-50s a comic called Princess Knight, as it's translated into English, which is about a princess who also is a knight. So she's like a princess by day, but she's a knight by the nighttime and goes around getting into adventures while still being a princess. I don't remember why we didn't order that one for our library. Maybe because it wasn't in stock at the bookstores at the moment. But we ended up getting, for our library, the Twin Knights, which is the sequel to Princess Knight. So in this case, the Princess Knight is grown up and married and has children of her own. And she has two twins. One of them, the boy, gets lost in the woods through a series of convoluted events. And so then the girl has to dress up as both the prince and the princess. And they have all sorts of adventures and eventually find each other again. So I don't know how much you can see on this camera. But if you flip through this book, it looks just so much fun. I mean, it looks just like a great children's cartoon. Not high art necessarily, but when it comes to like imitating Disney style or maybe the from the golden age of animation, Disney or any of its competitors at the time, doesn't this just look like a fun little cartoon that you just kind of have a good time in? There's some adventure going on here, but it's just a lot of very cartoony elements that look straight out of Disney or Max Fleischer or Warner Brothers or any of the periods of classic animation. Not to mention the kind of fairy tale elements that are all throughout this. So you flip through this, and just by flipping through this, you get the sense that this is going to be a lot of fun to read. Now, obviously, the target audience for this is a child, but to the extent that all of us have a child inside us that we like to indulge from time to time, you get to the extent that this is just going to be a fun little cartoon. It's certainly an example of why Tezuka Osamu was so popular in his day and why he remains so popular. I picked up a lot of Tezuka Osamu when I was in Japan, and I somewhat forget this, but comic books are so cheap in Japan, especially you can buy used comic books very cheaply. I picked up so many of the books, and a great many of them I only read about halfway through or a quarter way through, and then got sick of and never finished them. Now, partly this was because I was reading in Japanese, which even after 9 years, I never got completely fluent in. So it was an effort for me to read. But partly this was because I think the stories can sometimes be a little boring. And I was reminded of that a little bit while reading through this. So again, when you just flip through it and look at the atmosphere here, it's just a great atmosphere of classic animation meets fairy tale. But when you actually read through it, although the look of it is spot on, it's not very funny. So, the endless laughs you would get from Looney Tunes or Max Fleischer or Donald Duck or any of the classic animation on which the style is so clearly modeled, those laughs aren't there. I don't know, maybe it was funnier in the original Japanese, maybe it loses something in translation. There's a nice little fairy tale element here, but the fairy tales only kind of hold your attention for so long. So I somewhat regret to say that although this was very visually appealing, as I would sit down to read this every night, and I read this over, I don't know, about 4 nights, I'd read about 20 or 30 pages, and then I'd be like, okay, I've had enough for one night. Time to put this away for now. It just didn't grab me that much. There's also an issue with all of Tezuka Osamu's stuff. He can't keep a lighthearted tone. And I think that maybe this is cultural, maybe this is more of a Japanese thing. But there's a lighthearted kid story, but it's also mixed in with a little bit of pathos and an emphasis on sacrifice. So there are 2 characters who sacrifice themselves in this story. One of them is a major one, and kind of spoilers ahead. But there is a fawn, a deer, who is taking care of the prince who's abandoned in the woods. Her deal that she makes with the goddess of the forest is that she's allowed to attain human form during the night to care for this young prince. But if the prince ever finds out about this, she will die. Now the prince, as he grows up, actually turns out to be a hunting enthusiast. So you can maybe tell where this tragedy is going. Let me see if I can find the part in the story I'm looking for. Oh yeah. He captures the deer, not knowing that this is the sister. The deer has been posing as a sister who cares for him every night. He says, I'll skin you once my sister gets home. Oh, so that's a little bit heavy, huh? Not only is he talking about killing the deer, but talking about skinning it. And the deer is thinking to herself, I can't speak now. Ronnie, can't you see it's me, your sister? But she can't speak because, one, she's denied the power of human speech, I guess, when she's in deer form. So we come very close to some sort of, what's the word for killing your sister? Not fratricide, but sistercide. But then she does transform into a human, but in so doing, she dies because her secret is revealed. So I know I perhaps am sounding like I'm contradicting myself. First I said that the story is very boring because it's silly and there's nothing really there to keep you. Then I said it's sounding on the wrong notes because it's too tragic. But I think what I mean to say is tragedy is not what I want from this kind of animation style or this kind of story. What I want is kind of something a little bit more funny. Or maybe, I guess maybe I want more humor, less tragedy. But yeah, there's something like that in just about all of Tezuka Osamu's work to bring you down, even in his stuff for kids. And again, perhaps this is more cultural. There tends to be more tragedy in Japanese stories. But those notes aside, it is largely just a fun story. There's another note later on when a wolf sacrifices herself to save the princess. But those 2 notes aside, it's a fun story. Like I said, it's not quite as funny as it could be, or that as you'd want it to be. But it does have its charms. I don't mean to criticize this whole thing. There's a lot of fun-looking characters, fun setting, a fairy tale-esque element to it. It is a little bit episodic, maybe. I mean, there is an overarching story, but it is just kind of this happened, and this happened, and this happened. So I guess, sorry, I'm rambling. Sometimes I ramble. The bottom line is, very fun Disney-esque type cartoon animation. Some great fairy tale-esque panels here, which are great for our inner child. Story, the cartoonish element of it, when you look at it, you would expect something a lot more fun and humorous, and you don't quite get that as much as you want of that, but it still is pretty fun. Now, obviously, I am not the target demographic for this. As always, when you read a children's comic like this, I always imagine to myself, wouldn't this have been great if I could have read this when I was 6 or 7 or somewhere around that, I guess old enough to read, but young enough to really be taken in by this story. And when I was young, I don't believe Tezuka Osamu was available in translation. But I think I would like to track this book down in a couple years when my daughter's just a couple years older. I think this would be a 6 or 7-year-old kid, for them to have this on their bookshelves. This would just be so much fun for that age. Now, like I said, it's not quite as funny as it could be, but kids are easy to impress. So this great animation, these fairy tale type plot, yeah, and now that I think about it, a lot of Disney movies have kind of a downer part as well, right? I mean, Bambi's mother getting killed. There's always some tragic moment in the Disney movies, especially the early ones. Maybe actually that isn't so unique to Japan. I don't know. Let me know what you think. But yeah, I think if you have... this was originally made for girls, but I think really any child between maybe the ages of 6, 7, and 8... this would just be the perfect thing to get for them for their bookshelf. So I would really recommend it to that age group.